Greetings, lords and ladies, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to basically start the channel and have a look at runes, Old Norse language and literature, and then finally, I'll be talking about the Draugr, that are actually the Draugur or the Draugr, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Now, later on, I will start a series on the history of the English language, but for now, I think this might be interesting because I can tie it into Skyrim, among other things. So let's first talk about runes and where they came from and how they were employed. Well, the simple fact is that in reality, we don't have a ton of runes to look at and to study. There's a fair bit, but for the most part, we have a limited supply of them, and they don't really go that far back. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, runes, when we speak of European runes, really constitute two groups. The group I'm talking about, that I'm much more familiar with, would be the Germanic ones, and they're often called Futhark. They're called Futhark because those letters and those sounds represent the first 6 letters of that particular type of runic alphabet, so hence Futhark. There are also runes, primarily in Ireland, called Ogham. But these Ogham runes are, to my knowledge, based on what I've researched in the past, not related to the Futhark runes of the Germanic peoples. So they're two separate things. Ogham tends to be representative of primitive Irish and is really, to my knowledge, limited to the island of Ireland. And Futhark is distributed much more so than Ogham is. So you can find Futhark ruins in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, some places on the continent in Central Europe, and in Britain as well, after the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little about the origins. So for the most part, Germanic, for most of its history, that is to say, Germanic was not a written language. And when I speak of Germanic, I speak of the original language. And when we speak of an original language in historical linguistics, we talk about the so-called Proto-Language. And proto comes from the ancient word for first, protos. No allusion to StarCraft there, although I imagine that's what Blizzard was thinking when they called those aliens Protoss. And that's a reconstructed language, a hypothesized or theoretical language. Even we were certain that that kind of language existed, we have no written records, and thus we cannot tell whether or not certain things that we know to exist today were the same in that case. Not with absolute certainty, but we can reconstruct things and come up with some pretty good estimations. So Proto-Germanic was likely spoken someplace in Sweden originally, and somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. No one's exactly sure, for the simple reason that there are no written records. Probably as far back as 3,000 years, because you can tell are some hints. Certain Roman authors give hints when they talk about Germanic tribes, and these tribes he differentiated. And we're talking about tribes in Germany, in northern Germany, what is modern Germania, modern Germany, and that would represent some kind of drift away from Scandinavia. So plausibly, perhaps 3,000 years ago. Now, languages change over time. We tend not to have that feeling in modernity because of standardization. Radio, television, the internet, the written word, printing in the past, when Gutenberg came up with the printing press, which I'll be talking about at a much later date, really revolutionized things and led to at least a written standard, and that reinforces, of course, a type of overall standard. But that's a relatively recent phenomenon, especially with regards to radio and what have you. So we're talking about 100 years or so that we've actually had this reinforced standard. Before that time, what you had was a lot of disorganization, a lot of communities living apart from each other. And you can imagine what might happen if, let's say, a relatively small group of Germanic wanderers wander out of their area in Sweden to different parts of Europe. Over time, you're going to get differences in the languages they speak. Only slight differences in the beginning, and those differences will grow the longer the amount of time stands between them and the point of origin, if you will. So languages that have separated a long, long time ago will continue to bear less and less resemblance to the Proto-Language, but also to the other languages that might have taken a different course and might have gone in a different direction, geographic or otherwise, or both. So what happens is Proto-Germanic branches out, and then you end up with 3 branches of Germanic. You have West Germanic, which encompasses German, Dutch, these are the modern variants, of course, I'm talking about. German, Dutch, Frisian, which is spoken in the Frisian Islands. And by the way, Frisian is the most closely related language to English. And English. Then you have North Germanic, which comprises Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, as well as Faroese. Faroese is spoken in the Faroese Islands. It's quite different to the continental varieties, just as Icelandic is. And finally, you have Gothic, or East Germanic. This is actually an extinct branch. It's why we don't have any Gothic speakers these days. Gothic actually doesn't just refer to the people who walk around in dark clothing and powder their faces with white makeup or what have you. It actually refers to or for that matter, the architectural style. It actually refers to a language. And East Germanic literally that is Gothic specifically, the first written attested Germanic language we have. I'm not talking about the ruins, which I'll get into in a bit, but in terms of documentation, actually penned or rather scribed in a book. And what happened was a man named Wulfia, or Ulfias, depends on how you want to pronounce it, but Ulfia or Wulfia, meaning the little wolf, literally, was a Gothic scholar who had also a bishop, who of course was familiar with the Bible, and he translated the Greek Bible into Gothic. Now, the entirety of his translation has not survived, but significant chunks have. And you can tell a whole lot about the language based on these chunks that have survived. And the good thing about this, especially if you want to reconstruct languages, is that it's quite old. One estimates somewhere around the time 350 AD, or Common Era, if you prefer that. That's probably when he translated the Bible. Although the oldest manuscripts don't date that far back, but it's it's very likely that that's when he accomplished the deed. And as you can see here, this is the little snippet. This is the Lord's Prayer in Gothic. It's not all too foreign. It's certainly somewhat familiar, even if you have no training or no experience or knowledge with that language. And this constitutes the majority of our knowledge of Gothic, not the Lord's Prayer per se, but the various snippets and things that have been handed down to us. There is one more piece of Gothic literature. It's not a translation, but an original piece called the Skirins. The Skirins was written, we don't know exactly by whom, by some kind of Gothic scholar, probably in the 5th century, maybe the 6th century. And it's it is a religious commentary, but it's not a translation. And Skirins literally means explanation or understanding. So that's what that text is based on. But apart from this, these two pieces, the remnants of the biblical translation by Bishop Wulfia and the Skirins, there's not a whole lot left to us. Still, it gives us a fair bit of information on the Gothic language, and because of it's in a more primitive state or closer to the Proto-Language than the more recent pieces of Germanic literature, it allows us to understand certain aspects, grammatical aspects, phonological, that is the system of sound, aspects of the language that we otherwise would not understand or know about. But at some point in time, Gothic goes extinct most people think that there's a possibility that it survived well into the 14th century, but no one knows. What likely happened was, as the Goths and Eastern Germanic peoples, they don't just include the Goths, the Vandals, and so on and so forth, settled down in Roman areas, and eventually as the Roman Empire essentially fell to the Germanic so-called barbarians, tribesmen, they settled down and they were assimilated into the majority linguistic population, which spoke a form of late Latin, or vulgar Latin as called, and eventually further down the line they ended up speaking Romance languages, because that's what the majority of people did. They spoke a late form of Latin, and that's presumably what happened. So after that, after Gothic goes extinct, we're pretty much only left with West and North Germanic. And North Germanic remains pretty mysterious for quite some time, simply because the North Germanic people didn't really leave Scandinavia very much. However, there are some things that have been left to us, and this is where I'm going to start talking about runes. So Futhark, or Futhark, however you want to pronounce it, is this runic alphabet that actually does not comprise a complete and comprehensive writing system. They didn't compose works of literature in this, presumably. We have some fairly early stuff, material, inscriptions rather, from Futhark. In Futhark, in the form of inscriptions on objects, combs, helmets, swords. And the earliest of this dates back to about the 2nd century. So it's pretty early. And scholars theorize that these inscriptions, the little that we do have, represent a kind of Proto-Norse or Proto-North Germanic. So that was that parent language, or that particular language from which all other Germanic languages, North Germanic languages, stem. But the fact is there's not a whole lot in terms of inscriptions. It's important to understand, before I proceed, that Germanic literature, for most of its history, the vast majority of its history, was an oral tradition. But that's not even something that's unique to Germanic peoples. Throughout the world, if you look at Native Americans, the people in the Caucasus Mountains, in Western Asia, all across the world, Aborigines in Australia, there really is a robust oral tradition. I mean, that's how most literature throughout human history has been preserved. And the Germanic peoples were no exception in this regard. So the inscriptions are interesting, but they don't give us a whole lot. I mean, some of the inscriptions, you can have a look here, simply say, I made this, or I made that. That's not a whole lot. It gives you some kind of useful information in terms of the grammar, if that's what you're interested in, but there's not a whole lot of literature going on. So apart from the Gothic material, it takes a long time for Germanic literature to be transcribed on vellum. Vellum is animal parchment, which was standard fare in the Middle Ages in terms of writing things down, although not exclusively. And it takes a long time. Between the oldest Germanic texts we have are Old English texts, apart from, I'm not counting Gothic, so between appearing roughly sometime in the 7th century. And between that period of time and Gothic, well, we have, what, 4 centuries, roughly. So that's a fairly large chunk of time. As usual, most things back then of any merit or importance were written in Latin, even after Latin ceased to be a spoken language and had evolved into the modern, or at the time, the older versions of the Romance languages. So Germanic, in terms of the literature, is fairly new. Now, as far as runes are concerned, as you can see, Futhark looks like this. I've shown some pictures previously, but the simple fact is that as far as Skyrim is concerned, I'm almost willing to bet money that Skyrim ruins have very little to do with Germanic Futhark, even though one would be inclined to believe so, for the simple reason that Skyrim represents this sort of robust, rugged Nordic land, and thus ruins kind of makes sense in that context. It also doesn't seem to have taken much from Ogham. That is to say, Bethsaida in designing these Skyrim ruins didn't take very much from either. Now, before I get to what Bethsaida actually based the ruins on, rune in all Germanic languages, the old variants at least, actually means secret or something hidden. So there is the idea that there's some magical quality to runes is not too far off the mark when you consider that. And considering that writing is a fairly recent phenomenon in the history of language in general, but also that writing in terms of its accessibility was even more restricted until very recently, that is literacy, there is something magical to runes. Now, I did have to do a bit of research in finding out what Bethsaida based their runes on. Quite frankly, I don't know 100%. But I'm fairly certain, and Bethsaida did not communicate this to me, but I'm fairly certain that in fact Bethsaida based the runes on a completely different writing system to what you might have imagined or I might have imagined. So once again, not based on Germanic Futhark ruins, not based on Irish Ogham ruins, but based not on ruins but on a complete writing system, the oldest one in the world, that is cuneiform. Cuneiform comes from the Latin term for wedge-shaped. And it was devised by the Sumerians, the first civilization to write things down in humanity, in Mesopotamia, that is the modern Arabian Peninsula, and then used after the Sumerians disappeared or were assimilated by Akkadians, Assyrians, and so on and so forth. So this was the writing system par excellence of that time. And as you can see, cuneiform, on the whole, not a perfect resemblance, but it bears just an uncanny and striking resemblance to the runes we encounter on word walls in Skyrim. It's really uncanny, I think. And looking at several examples, or many examples of this, it seems almost certain that most of the material that Bethsaida took with regards to runes comes from cuneiform, which aren't runes, in fact. They're originally informed pictograms. But it makes sense that they took it from that if you just look at these very striking similarities. More to the point, I don't actually speak Draconic. I have no familiarity with the Draconic language. So Bethsaida might have created an entirely new language unto itself. Draconic might be completely intelligible to people versed in it. I don't know. So they might have borrowed the shapes and forms from cuneiform and then devised their own system. I really don't know. But it seems clear that that's where the runes come from, and not from Germanic or Celtic runes, not at all. Okay, so I hope that clears up the basics of runes and where they come from. To summarize, there's no literature written in runes really per se. They're basic, simple inscriptions, and yeah, Bethsaida probably took the runes, or at least the shapes, the aesthetics, from Sumerian cuneiform. Anyway, so moving on, let's talk a bit about Old Norse, or the Old Norse literature. So, as I said, the vast majority of all of the literature was oral, and the actual literature that's been handed down to us in written form doesn't come till much, much later. In particular, the mythology, for example, Norse mythology, which we've derived primarily from two sources, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which I'll get into in a bit. These were written centuries after most of Scandinavia had been converted to Christianity. So it's questionable just how authentic they exactly are, but it's likely, given the long oral tradition of the Germanic peoples, that they're pretty authentic nonetheless. And Old Norse literature really has two classifications. They have sort of what we call the Eddic classification, which is usually simple, usually prose, and it tends to describe much more, well, mythology than anything else, the kinds of things, Norse mythology, the gods, the stories of fabled heroes to some extent. And then you have a different kind, which is the skaldic verse. And I'm sure you've all heard of the skalds. They were essentially, well, Old Norse bards. The skalds would compose a very complicated verse in honor of, to sometimes in some cases, mythic heroes, but various rulers, often in the honor of Norse kings, and had a different style and a slightly different flavor to it, and it tended to be much more complicated. All Germanic poetry, including Old Norse, uses alliterative verse. That simply means that it uses the stress pattern of Germanic, which technically should always fall in the first syllable. And instead of rhyming, that's the pattern. You'll have a series, a repetition of words where the initial consonant, in rare cases the vowel, is identical. That's what we call alliterative verse. And that's the basis for Old Norse literature. And it was a very complicated affair. The most interesting characteristic about Germanic literature are the so-called kenningar, or the kennings in English. And these are basically metaphors, sometimes very complicated ones, that describe creatures, or people, or things that may or may not exist in some cases, in the case of fantastical mythological creatures. And one would imagine to that audience of that day, many, many hundreds of years ago, that they might be familiar with it, but to modern people, kennings or kenningar are pretty mysterious in some cases. In some cases they're obvious, in some cases they're not, but you'll see the use of kennings in Old English, lots of kennings in Beowulf and other Old English poems, but also in Old Norse literature as well. It's kind of a part of the staple of the literature. And the mythology comes down to us, as I said, primarily in the form of the Edda. There's a poetic version that's older, which is composed in verse, and we don't know exactly who wrote that. And there is a prose version that was written by a very, very famous Icelandic man, and his name was Snorri Sturluson. Snorri Sturluson was a historian, he was a poet, he was a politician. He basically gathered all of these myths and wrote them down in a prose form, and that's where we have a lot of the knowledge of Norse mythology. He also wrote another important work called the Heimskringla, literally the kind of the circle around the world. That's what it literally means, and that was kind of a history of the Norwegian kings. But for the most part, he's famous for that particular work, and that's how we know, or to some extent, how we know a fair bit about Norse mythology. We don't know if it's been polluted by Christianity or not. It might have been, but these are some of these stories. Presumably, as I said, it's well preserved because of the long oral tradition. Now, that's a bit about the literature. I don't want to go too much into it. I don't want to take forever on this video, and I don't want to bore you. For those who are interested, I could do an entire separate video on Old Norse literature. But some interesting things about Icelandic itself. Icelandic, which I used to study, I don't study it anymore, it's been quite some time, so I'm pretty rusty, is quite unique amongst the Scandinavian languages. Most of the Scandinavian languages, particularly Danish, Norwegian, both Bokmål and Nynorsk, as well as Swedish, are pretty simple. By simple I mean their grammar isn't that complicated, and so on and so forth. Icelandic is quite unique in it's called what we call a linguistic outlier. Because it's existed in isolation for so long, it really has retained the vast majority of the complex grammar that characterized Old Norse. as well as sounds that have disappeared in modern, more modern, if you want to call them, Scandinavian languages. It doesn't sound exactly like Old Norse. There are some differences, and when I pronounce or read or have read Old Norse literature, for convenience sake, I tend to use the modern Icelandic pronunciation, even though that's probably not exactly how it was pronounced back then, but it's helpful sometimes. And it's preserved this way. It's been preserved this way for an incredibly long time. That's to say that a modern Icelandic person, he or she can literally pick up, the Edda written by Snorri Sturluson at the beginning of the 13th century, and read it with almost no problems whatsoever. So 800 years ago, pick it up. I doubt most native English speakers could pick up a early 13th century Middle English text and just read it without any problems. Would you be able to recognize some things? Sure, but not to the extent that Icelandic people can do that. It's very, very, very interesting in that regard. Faroese is also quite archaic, but it is somewhat different to Icelandic, although it is originally derived from Old Norse as well. So Icelandic is very archaic. Another thing that they've done routinely is to, as an example of how archaic and Icelandic is, most European languages have the same word for information. In German it's Information, in French it's Information, in English it's information. Then even Slavic languages tend to be similar as well, though I'm not as familiar with Slavic languages. Not so in Icelandic. No, information is upplýsingar. Upplýsingar. Upplýsingar is information, just as an example. And what they tend to do is they don't accept any foreign words into their vocabulary. So they'll just convert it into an Icelandic word. So the word for telephone is farsimi, far away. Simi is cord or wire. They're pretty creative like that. The Danes used to rule Iceland, and when they left, they sort of purged the language and just evolved even Danish borrowings. They didn't want any of it, so they got rid of all of that. And Icelandic is very archaic in that regard, and even the names. I mean, Icelandic people have, generally speaking, what we call a patronymic name system. So you don't have this sort of family names like most people do. A Smith or a Zimmerman, or so on and so forth. You don't have these names. Patrick Stewart. No, what you usually do is you take the father's name, and then you add the suffix, the addition of daughter or son. So Snorri, the author of the early 13th century, is Snorri Sturluson. Sturluson is the son of Sturli, his father, Sturli. In the same token, you could theoretically do this with everything. In fact, I have Skyrim characters that are the ones that are Nords. I usually use the patronymic naming system. So I had a female Nord warrior, and I called her in her last name, at least her surname, Sturladóttir, which is the daughter of Sturla, and so try to keep it real like that in Skyrim. So that's another interesting aspect of Icelandic culture. I don't want to take too much time on this, but anyway, so just to give you an idea of where that all comes from. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the Draugr, the undead, in Skyrim, and let me say that generally speaking, they did a pretty good job about the accuracy of the Draugr. Now, Draugr is not the correct pronunciation. In modern Icelandic, it would be Draugur. In Old Icelandic, probably much more similar to Draugur, and there's actually a separate plural form. So the singular would be Draugar, but the plural would be Draugar, A-R, Draugar. So henceforth I'll be referring to them as Draugar. And it's quite well done in Skyrim, because Draugar actually existed, at least in some of the tales. Mostly from this, we know this mostly from a few sagas. There's a very famous saga called Grettir Saga. Grettir was a hero, presumably a mythic one, who fought Draugar, among other things. And I'll be posting a list of some pieces of literature that might be of interest to people at the end. And we know that these Draugar existed, at least in the fantasies of the Vikings, because they write about them. Now, what's interesting is the description of Draugar is often along the lines of how we see them in Skyrim. They're described as being sort of burnt or sort of blackened, but with the glowing eyes. Sometimes they're described as being sort of blue, in the sense of a corpse. Now, one thing it's important to note is Draugar are not ghosts. They're almost invariably a reference to animated undead. They're reanimated. But it gets trickier than this, and this is something quite interesting, because in the Old Norse literature, there's a distinction between Draugar and another kind of undead, which is more or less the same thing. These undead are called Høgbui. Høgbui are also basically Draugar, but they're confined to their barrow. And Høgr in Old Norse means barrow, literally. And bui is a dweller, so a dweller of a barrow, in a barrow. They're actually not, as far as can be discerned from the literature, allowed to leave their barrow. They're stuck there. Draugar are vengeful spirits. Well, they're reanimated undead, but they can leave, and they can torment the living. And Draugar, in the tradition of Norse literature, of the sagas, their primary motivation on death is to torment the living. They hate the living. They envy them for their heartbeats, for their living essence. And in that sense, I suppose it's pretty accurate in Skyrim, because, well, I've never met a Draugar that wasn't hostile, at least not using the console to modify things, hostile to me in Skyrim. But the Draugar in Skyrim are actually much more akin to Høgbui, dwellers of barrows, because they rarely leave. I suppose there's some exceptions. I think the one next to, there's a Draugar in the coffin next to Dustman's cairn. Cairn, by the way, is a Celtic word. It's not a Germanic word. So once you see, again, I think fantasy tends to be a bit of an amalgam of many, many different elements. And in the sagas, these Draugar have magical powers. They can often meld into the earth. They can often shapeshift. They can cast curses upon the living, and so on and so forth. And there actually was an Old English word that was similar, Draug, but it's died out since. But you do actually encounter a kind of Draugar in a major epic poem, in Beowulf. Now, the protagonist enemy of Beowulf, Grendel, this monster, is never called a Draug or a Draugar, but he bears this uncanny resemblance to him. He's described as being able to shift shape and to sort of meld into the shadows. He's often called a shadow walker and things of this nature. So there's a lot of similarity there. And speaking of kennings, as I did before, these metaphors, often in literature, Draugar are described as afterganger. An afterganger is literally an afterwalker, an aftergoer. That which, or he who walks after. So after is the word for after, and ganger is goer. And that's one of these metaphors, these kennings, for this kind of undead creature. And the monster in Beowulf is described along similar lines. So I think overall Bethsaida got it more or less right. There's a fine distinction, as most Draugar are confined to their barrows, but the visuals, the aesthetics, they definitely got that right. I think they look very, very similar to the way they're at least described in the literature of the past. But yeah, they're definitely not ghosts. They're animated, reanimated undead. And as a final note, this is my speculation. I have no way of proving this one way or another, but I'd like to think that, given the description in the Old Norse literature of Draugar, the glowing eyes, I think the modern incarnation of the Lich, even though it's derived from the word for corpse, might have something to do with it. You know, this vengeful spirit. As I said, in the sagas, Draugar can work different kinds of sorcery sometimes. Grendel can do that to an extent as well. So maybe that's at least part of the influence in the idea for the Lich in the modern fantasy genre. Who knows? Just my speculation here, based on the description of Draugar in literature. So all in all, modern fantasy stuff tends to be an amalgam of many, many different things. As you can see, it's highly likely that Bethsaida borrowed the forms of the runes from Mesopotamian cuneiform. So it's just kind of this mishmash of all kinds of things, but I think that's pretty cool. There's no doubt that some elements of Old Norse myth have crept their way into the game, but the full extent probably can't possibly be known. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it wasn't too boring for you, and I look forward to your views and comments. And as always, if you enjoyed that, please like and subscribe. There will hopefully, the gods willing, if the gods watch over me, be more videos forthcoming. The next one planned will be the beginning of a somewhat lengthy series on the history of the English language. So I hope you enjoyed that, and may the gods watch over you, and everyone have a pleasant day, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. And I shall see you all fairly soon, hopefully. So take care, and may the gods bless and preserve you. Bye-bye.